What happens when the people who should protect you become your biggest threat? When the home you grew up in suddenly becomes a place you're no longer welcome. My name is Clara, and at a family dinner, my brothers gave me an ultimatum that shattered my world. You have 2 days to get your stuff out, they said. But what they didn't know was that our mother had left me something far more powerful than the house they were trying to steal. Welcome to What No One Told Her, where we share the stories that reveal how strength is often forged in the fires of betrayal. If you've ever felt like your family was working against you, if you've ever been underestimated by those who should know you best, then hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about inheritance. It's about a mother's hidden plan, a sister's quiet strength, and how sometimes the greatest victories come from refusing to accept defeat. This is the story of how my brothers tried to evict me from my own home, and how a secret my mother had kept for 20 years turned their greed into their downfall. Chapter 1. Order at the Family Dinner. The roast chicken, which had been the centerpiece of our Sunday family dinner for as long as I could remember, sat untouched on my plate, suddenly tasteless and indigestible. The familiar dining room of my childhood home, a space that had once been filled with laughter and love, now felt cold and hostile, the walls closing in on me with the weight of my brother's ultimatum. You have 2 days, Clara. My older brother, Mark, delivered the words with the same detached professionalism he used to close multi-million-dollar real estate deals. At 45, he was the picture of success, a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my car, a Rolex that gleamed under the dining room chandelier, and an expression that conveyed absolute confidence in his own authority. 2 days to get your stuff out, my younger brother, Thomas, echoed, his tone carrying the smug satisfaction of someone who had just won a game he had been playing for years. At 40, he had followed in Mark's footsteps, becoming a successful corporate lawyer who specialized in finding legal loopholes that would benefit his wealthy clients. The stuff they were referring to was my life. The antique furniture I had inherited from our grandmother. The collection of first edition books I had spent years accumulating. The boxes of memories, photographs, letters, childhood drawings that chronicled our family's history. But most importantly, my stuff included me, because for the past 3 years, I had been living in this house, caring for our mother during her long and difficult battle with cancer. Our mother had passed away 6 weeks earlier, and in the raw aftermath of her death, I had assumed that our family bonds would become stronger, that we would find comfort in our shared grief and mutual support. Instead, Mark and Thomas had revealed a side of themselves I had never seen before, a cold, calculating greed that seemed to have been lying dormant just beneath the surface of our sibling relationship. I don't understand, I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. This is my home. Mom wanted me to stay here. Mom wanted a lot of things, Mark replied, dismissing our mother's wishes with a casual wave of his hand. But what she wanted doesn't matter as much as what the will says. And the will, as you know, divides the estate equally among the 3 of us. Which means this house and everything in it belongs to all of us, Thomas added, his legal training evident in the precision of his language. And Mark and I have decided that the most financially responsible course of action is to sell the property as quickly as possible. The market is strong right now, and we can get a good price if we move quickly. The house wasn't just a property, it was the repository of our family's entire history. Every mark on the doorframe that charted our childhood growth, every worn spot on the carpet where we had played for hours, every memory that was baked into the very walls of the building, all of it was being reduced to a real estate transaction, a number on a balance sheet that my brothers found more compelling than any sentimental attachment. But where am I supposed to go? I asked, the question revealing the full extent of my vulnerability. At 42, I had made choices that were very different from my brothers. While they had pursued wealth and professional success, I had become a high school English teacher, a profession that offered intellectual satisfaction but not financial security. I had savings, but not enough to afford a down payment on a new home, especially not in the expensive suburban town where we had grown up. My mother's illness had made my financial situation even more precarious. For the past 3 years, I had taken a reduced teaching schedule to become her full-time caregiver, a decision that had saved our family thousands of dollars in medical expenses but had left me with diminished income and depleted savings. That's not really our problem, is it? Thomas said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. You chose a career that doesn't pay well. You chose to live here rent-free while Mark and I were building our lives and our careers. You're a grown woman, Clara. It's time you started acting like one. The cruelty of his words was breathtaking. I had sacrificed my career, my financial security, and my personal life to care for our mother, a responsibility that my brothers had conveniently avoided by claiming they were too busy with their own demanding lives. They had visited occasionally, bringing expensive flowers and offering empty platitudes, but the day-to-day work of caregiving, the doctor's appointments, the medication schedules, the emotional support, the personal care, had fallen entirely on my shoulders. And now, with our mother gone, they were treating my sacrifice not as a contribution to the family, but as a personal failure that I needed to correct on my own. "We're not completely heartless," Mark said, his tone softening slightly in a way that was more manipulative than compassionate. "Your 1/3 share of the estate will be substantial. Once the house is sold, you'll have enough money to buy a nice little apartment somewhere." "A nice little apartment somewhere?" I repeated, my voice rising with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "This is our home. Mom's home. She loved this house. She wanted us to keep it in the family." "Mom was a sentimentalist," Thomas said dismissively. "We're realists. And the reality is that this house is an asset that needs to be liquidated. You have 48 hours to pack your things and find somewhere else to stay. After that, we'll be changing the locks and bringing in a real estate agent to prepare the property for sale." I looked at my brothers, these men I had grown up with, had shared secrets with, had believed would always have my back, and I saw strangers. Their faces were familiar, but their eyes held a coldness that I had never seen before. They were not my brothers anymore. They were my adversaries, my opponents in a legal and emotional battle that I was completely unprepared to fight. As the silence in the dining room grew heavy and oppressive, I felt a familiar sense of defeat begin to creep over me. My entire life, I had been the sensitive one, the artistic one, the sister who was not as smart or as driven or as successful as her two older brothers. I had always deferred to their judgment, had always allowed them to take the lead in family matters, had always believed that they knew what was best for all of us. But something inside me snapped at that moment. The grief over my mother's death, which had been a constant ache for the past 6 weeks, suddenly solidified into something harder, something more resilient, something that felt like anger. I stood up from the dining room table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo the grating of my own nerves. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Mark and Thomas looked at me with expressions of mild surprise, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started talking. "I'm sorry, did you say something?" Mark asked, a condescending smile playing on his lips. "I said I'm not going anywhere," I repeated, my voice growing stronger. "This is my home as much as it is yours. And you're not going to bully me out of it." Thomas laughed, a short, barking sound that held no amusement. "Clara, you don't have a legal leg to stand on. The will is clear. We're offering you a fair deal. If you try to fight this, you'll only end up with a smaller share of the estate after we deduct our legal fees." "We'll see about that," I said, though I had no idea what I was going to do or how I was going to fight them. As I walked out of the dining room and up the stairs to my bedroom, I could hear them laughing behind me, confident in their victory, already discussing which real estate agent to hire and how to stage the house for a quick sale. What they didn't know was that our mother, in her final weeks, had given me something that wasn't mentioned in her will. A key to a safe deposit box at our local bank, and a cryptic instruction that had made no sense at the time but was now beginning to seem like a message from beyond the grave. "When they show you who they really are," my mother had whispered to me, her voice weak but her eyes clear and sharp, "use this to remind them who I was." I didn't know what I would find in that safe deposit box, but as I sat on my bed, holding the small brass key in my hand, I felt a flicker of hope that my mother, even in death, had anticipated this betrayal and had prepared a final defense for the daughter she had always loved. Chapter 2. The Ignored Sacrifice. Looking back now, I can see that my brother's transformation from supportive siblings to ruthless adversaries didn't happen overnight. The seeds of their greed had been planted years earlier, watered by a lifetime of privilege and fertilized by a culture that values financial success above all other achievements. Mark, the oldest, had always been driven by a need to prove himself. As the firstborn son of a successful surgeon, he had felt the pressure of our father's expectations from a young age. He had excelled at everything he did, not because he loved the activities themselves, but because he loved the validation that came with winning. His career in real estate development had been a natural extension of this competitive drive, a game where the biggest buildings and the largest profits determined the winner. Thomas, the middle child, had chosen a different path but with the same underlying motivation. He had become a corporate lawyer, specializing in mergers and acquisitions, a profession that allowed him to use his intelligence as a weapon, to find legal advantages that would benefit his clients while destroying their opponents. He loved the intellectual combat of the courtroom, the strategic maneuvering of contract negotiations, the feeling of outsmarting people who were not as clever as he was. And then there was me, Clara, the youngest and only daughter, the one who had never been interested in competition or conquest. I had loved books from a young age, had found more satisfaction in a beautifully crafted sentence than in a well-executed business deal. My decision to become an English teacher had been a source of quiet disappointment for my father, who had hoped all his children would pursue more lucrative professions, but my mother had always supported my choice. "Someone has to teach the next generation to appreciate beauty," she would say whenever my father made a casual comment about the financial limitations of a teacher's salary. "Not everything in life has a price tag, my dear." Our family dynamic had always been shaped by these differing values. Mark and Thomas were the successful ones, the sons who had met and exceeded our father's expectations. I was the artistic one, the daughter who was loved but not quite taken seriously, the sibling whose life choices were viewed with a mixture of affection and pity. When our mother was diagnosed with cancer 5 years ago, this dynamic became even more pronounced. The diagnosis had come as a shock to all of us. Our mother had always been the vibrant, energetic center of our family, the person who organized our holidays, mediated our disputes, and provided the emotional glue that held us all together. At first, Mark and Thomas had been attentive, visiting regularly, calling frequently, and offering to pay for the best medical care available. But as the initial crisis gave way to the long, slow, grinding reality of cancer treatment, their attention began to wander. Their business trips became more frequent, their visits less regular, their phone calls shorter and more distracted. "I'm in the middle of closing a major deal, Clara," Mark would say when I called to update him on our mother's condition. "Can we talk about this later?" "I have to prepare for a court case next week," Thomas would explain. "I'm working around the clock. You'll have to handle things for a while." And so, I handled things. I drove our mother to her chemotherapy appointments, sat with her during the long hours of infusion, held her hand when the nausea and pain became unbearable. I managed her medications, coordinated her home care, and provided the day-to-day emotional support that her 2 successful sons were too busy to offer. It was not a role I had chosen, but it was one I accepted without resentment. I loved my mother, and caring for her during her final years felt like the most important work I could possibly do. I didn't ask my brothers for financial help, though my reduced teaching schedule was creating a significant strain on my savings. I didn't complain about the personal sacrifices I was making, the social life I had given up, the dreams of travel and further education I had put on hold. My mother, however, was not oblivious to the situation. As her illness progressed and her dependence on my care increased, I could see a growing sadness in her eyes whenever she spoke about my brothers. "They're good boys," she would say, as if trying to convince herself as much as me. "They're just very busy with their important lives." But during her final months, when she was confined to her bed and the reality of her approaching death had become unavoidable, she began to speak more openly about her concerns for my future. "I worry about you, Clara," she said to me one afternoon as I sat by her bedside, reading to her from her favorite book of poetry. "You've given up so much for me. What will you do when I'm gone?" "I'll be fine, Mom," I had replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'll go back to teaching full-time. I'll figure things out. Your brothers will help you, of course," she had said. but her tone held a question rather than a statement of fact. "They'll make sure you're taken care of." I didn't have the heart to tell her that my brothers had never offered to help financially, that they seemed to view my role as her caregiver as a natural extension of my less demanding career choice. I didn't want to add to her worries during her final days, so I simply nodded and changed the subject. It was 2 weeks before she died that she gave me the key to the safe deposit box. She had been having a rare good day, with a clarity of mind that had become increasingly infrequent. She asked me to retrieve a small jewelry box from her dresser, and from it, she produced a single old-fashioned brass key. "This is for you," she said, pressing it into my hand. "It's for a safe deposit box at the First National Bank downtown. The box is in my name, but I've added you as a signatory." "What's in it?" I had asked, confused. "Something you might need one day," she had replied cryptically. "Something to remind your brothers of who I was, and what I valued, if they ever forget." Her words had made no sense to me at the time. I had assumed the box contained some sentimental items she wanted me to have, old letters, family photographs, perhaps a piece of jewelry that had special meaning for her. I had put the key in my own jewelry box and had forgotten about it in the chaos and grief of her final days. Now, as I sat in my bedroom after my brothers had delivered their ultimatum, her words came back to me with a sudden, chilling clarity. "When they show you who they really are, use this to remind them who I was." My brothers had just shown me exactly who they were. Greedy, ruthless men who valued money more than family, who viewed my sacrifice as a weakness to be exploited rather than a contribution to be honored. And now it was time for me to find out what my mother had left me to fight them with. Chapter 3: The Safe and the Secret Testament. The next morning, I drove to the First National Bank with my mother's key clutched so tightly in my hand that its pattern was imprinted on my palm. The bank itself was an old, imposing building, the kind of institution that had been founded on principles of trust and stability that seemed to belong to a bygone era. The safe deposit vault was in the basement, behind a massive steel door that required 2 keys to open, mine and the bank manager's. The bank manager, a kind-faced man in his late 50s named Mr. Henderson, remembered my mother fondly. "She was one of our first customers when we opened this branch 30 years ago, he said as he led me to the vault. "A lovely woman. I was so sorry to hear of her passing." He used his key to unlock one of the 2 locks on the heavy steel door, then stood back as I inserted my own key and turned it. The door swung open with a satisfyingly solid click, revealing a wall of metal boxes in various sizes. My mother's box was small, unassuming, located in a row near the floor. Mr. Henderson retrieved the box and handed it to me, then led me to a small, private viewing room where I could examine its contents. The box itself was heavier than I had expected, and as I sat down at the small desk in the viewing room, my heart began to pound with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. I lifted the lid and found myself staring at a collection of documents that had been carefully organized and labeled in my mother's neat, familiar handwriting. There were no sentimental items, no old letters or photographs, no pieces of jewelry. This was not a box of memories, it was a box of evidence. The first document I examined was a legally binding contract that had been drawn up by a lawyer I didn't recognize. It was dated 3 years earlier, just after my mother's cancer diagnosis, and it outlined the terms of an agreement between her and me. In exchange for my services as her full-time caregiver, the contract stipulated that I would receive full ownership of the house upon her death, separate and apart from any other provisions in her will. The contract had been signed by my mother, by me, and by 2 witnesses, her doctor and her nurse, and had been notarized by a legal professional. It was an ironclad legal document that clearly superseded the terms of the will my brothers were using as the basis for their eviction notice. But that was just the beginning. The box also contained a series of financial records that documented every expense related to my mother's care over the past 3 years. There were receipts for medications, bills from home health aides, invoices for medical equipment, and detailed calculations of the income one had lost by reducing my teaching schedule. Alongside these records was a separate ledger that tracked every financial contribution my brothers had made to our mother's care. The ledger was almost completely empty, showing only a few small amounts for flower deliveries and one larger contribution for a specialized medical consultation that their insurance had refused to cover. But the most devastating document in the box was a new will, dated just 1 month before my mother's death, that revoked all previous versions and outlined a completely different distribution of her estate. This will, which had also been legally witnessed and notarized, contained a clause that explained her reasoning in heartbreaking detail. To my sons, Mark and Thomas, the will read, "I leave my love and my disappointment." I had hoped that the challenges of my final years would bring our family closer together, but instead, they have revealed a transactional approach to love that I find deeply disturbing. Your financial success has been a source of pride for me, but it has also created a distance between us that I have been unable to bridge. You have provided financial support when asked, but you have not provided the emotional support that a mother needs from her children. Therefore, I am leaving the bulk of my estate to the one child who has demonstrated through her actions that she understands what family truly means. The will went on to specify that Mark and Thomas would each receive a token inheritance of $10,000, enough to remind them that they were once my beloved sons, while the remainder of the estate, including the house, all financial assets, and all personal property, would be left to me, Clara, in recognition of her selfless sacrifice and unwavering love. As I read the words my mother had written, tears streamed down my face. I was not crying out of joy for my newfound financial security, but out of a profound sadness for the pain my mother must have felt during her final months, the pain of knowing that 2 of her children had essentially abandoned her when she needed them most. But there was one final document in the box, a handwritten letter addressed to me, that revealed the full extent of my mother's foresight and strategic thinking. My dearest Clara, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means your brothers have behaved exactly as I feared they would. They have shown you their true character, and now it is time for you to show them yours. The documents in this box are your weapons, but you must use them wisely. Do not reveal them all at once. Let your brothers believe they have the upper hand. Let them proceed with their plans to sell the house. Let them hire lawyers and file legal documents and celebrate their apparent victory. And then, at the moment when they are most confident, at the moment when they believe they have defeated you completely, present them with the truth. Show them the caregiver contract. Show them the new will. Show them the ledger that documents their absence and your sacrifice. This is not about revenge, my dear. This is about justice. It is about teaching your brothers a lesson they have been unable to learn in any other way. That love is not a transaction, that family is not a business, and that some things in life are more valuable than money. They have underestimated you your entire life, Clara. They have seen your kindness as weakness, your sensitivity as fragility. Now it is time for them to see what I have always known, that you are the strongest of all my children, and that your strength lies not in your ability to conquer the world, but in your capacity to love it. I sat in that small, quiet viewing room for over an hour, reading and rereading my mother's words, holding the documents that represented her final act of love and protection. My grief for her was still a raw, open wound, but now it was mixed with a new feeling, a quiet, steely resolve that I had never experienced before. My mother had given me a roadmap for the battle that lay ahead, and I was determined to follow it not just for my own sake, but for hers. Mark and Thomas had underestimated their sister, but more importantly, they had underestimated their mother. And now they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about the consequences of that miscalculation. Chapter 4: Feigning Defeat. Armed with the secret my mother had left me, I returned home to find an eviction notice taped to the front door. It was a formal legal document, drawn up by Thomas's law firm, informing me that I had 48 hours to vacate the premises before legal proceedings would be initiated to have me forcibly removed. The language was cold, impersonal, and designed to intimidate. But now, instead of feeling intimidated, I felt a strange sense of calm. My mother's letter had given me not just a legal strategy but a psychological one. Let them believe they were winning. That evening, I called Mark and Thomas and played the role of the defeated younger sister they had always known. My voice was shaky, my words were hesitant, and I allowed myself to sound completely overwhelmed by their legal maneuvering. "I can't fight you on this," I said, allowing a note of resignation to enter my voice. You have the lawyers, you have the money, you have the will. I don't stand a chance. We're glad you're finally seeing reason, Clara, Mark said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who has just closed a successful business deal. It's for the best. We'll have the real estate agent come by on Wednesday to assess the property. Can you give me a little more time? I pleaded, making my voice sound desperate. I have so much to pack. So many of Mom's things to sort through. I can't do it all in 2 days. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line as my brothers conferred. I could almost hear their calculations. How much would a few extra days cost them versus the potential legal hassle of a forced eviction? All right, Thomas said finally. We'll give you until the end of the week. But that's it. Next Monday, we're changing the locks, whether you're out or not. Thank you, I whispered, and then hung up before they could hear the note of triumph that I was struggling to conceal. The next few days were a masterclass in strategic deception. I began packing boxes, but not with the frantic energy of someone preparing to move. Instead, I worked slowly, methodically, using the time to document everything in the house. I took photographs of every room, every piece of furniture, every item that had sentimental value. I created a detailed inventory of my mother's personal effects, noting which items had been gifts from me and which had been purchased during the years I had been her caregiver. I also began making my own legal preparations. I found a lawyer, a woman named Sarah Jenkins who specialized in estate law and had a reputation for being a fierce advocate for her clients. When I showed her the documents from my mother's safe deposit box, her eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that only a lawyer can feel when presented with an ironclad case. This is extraordinary, she said, examining the caregiver contract and the second will. Your mother was a very smart woman. These documents are legally unassailable. Your brothers don't have a leg to stand on. Sarah and I developed a strategy that mirrored the one my mother had laid out in her letter. We would not reveal our hand immediately. Instead, we would let my brothers proceed with their plans to sell the house, allowing them to incur legal fees, real estate commissions, and other expenses associated with the sale. We would wait until the moment when they were most confident in their victory, when the sale of the house was imminent and their share of the profits seemed secure. The more time and money they invest in this process, Sarah explained, the more devastating the revelation will be when we finally show them the truth. This isn't just about winning a legal case, it's about teaching them a lesson in humility. On Wednesday, the real estate agent arrived, a woman whose professional smile couldn't quite conceal her discomfort with the situation. She walked through the house with Mark, discussing staging strategies, potential asking prices, and the commissions she would earn from the sale. I remained upstairs in my room, listening to their conversation, feeling like a ghost in my own home. Don't worry about the sister, I heard Mark tell the agent in a conspiratorial whisper. She'll be gone by Monday. She's a bit of an emotional wreck right now, but she's accepted the reality of the situation. I had to suppress a smile. My brother, the master negotiator, had no idea that he was the one who was being manipulated, the one who was walking into a trap that had been set for him with meticulous care. The next few days were a strange mixture of grief and anticipation. Packing my mother's belongings was a painful process, each object a reminder of her absence. But every box I packed also felt like a step in a larger plan, a move in a chess game that my mother had designed to ensure that her values, and not my brother's, would ultimately prevail. By Friday afternoon, the house was filled with boxes, creating the perfect visual evidence of my apparent defeat. I had even arranged for a small moving truck to be parked in the driveway on Saturday morning, a piece of strategic theater designed to convince my brothers that I was preparing to leave as they had demanded. On Sunday, I called them again, my voice filled with manufactured panic. The moving truck is here, but I haven't been able to find a place to live yet, I said. Can I put some of my things in the storage unit you mentioned? Of course, Thomas said, his voice carrying the magnanimous tone of a victor offering concessions to the vanquished. Just make sure you're out of the house by tomorrow morning. The cleaning crew is scheduled to arrive at 9. I will, I promised. Thank you for being so understanding. The stage was set. All the pieces were in place. My brothers were confident, secure in their belief that they had won, that their younger sister had been easily defeated by their superior intelligence and legal maneuvering. They were about to learn that there are some things in life that cannot be measured by a balance sheet, and that a mother's love, even from beyond the grave, can be the most powerful legal weapon of all. Chapter 5. The Turnaround. Monday morning arrived with a sense of theatrical anticipation. At exactly 8:45 a.m., I saw my brother's cars pull into the driveway, Mark in his black Mercedes, Thomas in his silver BMW. They got out and stood for a moment, admiring the house that would soon make them hundreds of thousands of dollars richer. Their expressions were a mixture of satisfaction and impatience, the look of men who were eager to finalize a profitable transaction. They used their own keys to enter the house, not bothering to knock, and found me sitting at the dining room table, surrounded by boxes, a cup of coffee in my hands. I had dressed carefully for this moment, not in the comfortable clothes of someone preparing to move, but in a professional business suit that I had reserved for parent-teacher conferences and other formal occasions. "Clara, what are you still doing here?" Mark asked, his tone sharp with annoyance. "The cleaning crew will be here in 15 minutes. You were supposed to be gone." "I thought we should have one last family meeting," I said, my voice calm and steady in a way that seemed to surprise them. "There are some documents I think you should see before you proceed with the sale of the house." Thomas laughed. "More legal documents, Clara? Are you going to show us an article you found on the internet about squatters' rights? I assure you, it won't hold up in court." "No," I replied, maintaining my composure. "Not an article from the internet. A legally binding contract, drawn up by a lawyer and notarized, that outlines the terms of my employment as our mother's caregiver for the past 3 years." I slid a copy of the caregiver contract across the table toward them. Thomas picked it up, his expression one of bored amusement, but as he began to read, his smile slowly faded, replaced by a look of confusion and then dawning horror. "What is this?" he stammered, passing the document to Mark. "It's a contract," I explained. "It stipulates that in exchange for my full-time care, which saved our family an estimated $200,000 in medical and home care expenses, I would receive full ownership of this house upon Mom's death." Mark's face, which had been a mask of confident authority just moments earlier, seemed to crumble. "This is ridiculous. It's not legally valid. The will is what matters." "Actually," I said, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have, "the will is what matters. Which is why I think you should also look at this." I slid a second document across the table, a copy of the new will my mother had signed just 1 month before her death. This time, it was Mark who picked it up, his hands trembling slightly as he read the clause that disinherited him and Thomas, leaving them each a token inheritance of $10,000 while bequeathing the entire remainder of the estate to me. "She wouldn't do this," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "She loved us." "She did love you," I replied, my own voice softening with a sadness that was genuine. "But she was also deeply disappointed in you. She saw how you abandoned her when she needed you most, and she wanted to ensure that her estate would go to the child who had demonstrated through actions, not just words, what family really means." For a long moment, the dining room was silent except for the sound of my brother's ragged breathing. The two most successful, confident, and ruthless men I had ever known were suddenly looking like lost little boys, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. "This won't hold up in court," Thomas said finally, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "We'll contest it. We'll claim undue influence. We'll argue that she wasn't of sound mind when she signed it." "You can certainly try," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "But I think you'll find that Mom was very thorough. The will was witnessed by her doctor and her nurse, both of whom are prepared to testify about her mental clarity during her final weeks. The caregiver contract is supported by 3 years of financial records that document every penny you didn't spend on her care. And I have a handwritten letter from her explaining her reasoning in heartbreaking detail." I slid the final document across the table, my mother's last letter to me. As my brothers read her words, their last defenses seemed to crumble completely. The letter was not angry or vengeful, it was filled with a mother's sadness and disappointment, her dawning realization that the son she had raised to be successful had lost something far more valuable along the way. "I don't believe this," Mark said, sinking into one of the dining room chairs. "After everything we've done, everything we've achieved, she leaves us with nothing?" "She didn't leave you with nothing," I corrected him. "She left you with $10,000 and a very expensive lesson about the true meaning of wealth." Just then, the doorbell rang. It was the cleaning crew, arriving exactly at 9 o'clock as scheduled. "You should probably tell them they're not needed today," I said to my brothers. "I have no intention of moving. And I have no intention of selling this house." Thomas stared at me, his lawyer's mind calculating the odds, running through the legal arguments, and finally coming to the conclusion that he had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. "You planned this," he said, his voice a mixture of accusation and grudging respect. "You let us think we were winning. You let us hire lawyers and real estate agents and moving trucks. You planned this whole thing." "No," I replied, standing up from the table and walking to the window that overlooked the gardens my mother had loved so much. "I didn't plan it. Mom did." Chapter 6: The Consequences. The aftermath of that confrontation was as devastating as my mother had intended. For the first time in their lives, Mark and Thomas were faced with a situation they couldn't control, a problem they couldn't solve with money or legal threats or displays of professional authority. They had been completely and utterly defeated, not by a business rival or a legal opponent, but by their own sister and the ghost of their disappointed mother. Their initial reaction was a predictable mixture of anger and denial. They threatened to sue, to contest the will, to drag me through years of expensive legal battles that would drain the estate and leave all of us with nothing. They accused me of manipulating our mother during her final days, of taking advantage of her illness to secure a larger share of the inheritance. But their threats were hollow, and they knew it. The legal case my mother had constructed was airtight. The caregiver contract was legally binding, the second will was properly executed and witnessed, and the financial records documenting their neglect were meticulously detailed and irrefutable. Any court challenge would be a waste of time and money, a fact that their own lawyers confirmed after reviewing the documents I had provided. The real estate agent was dismissed, the cleaning crew was sent home, and the "for sale" sign that had been scheduled for installation was cancelled. The house, my mother's house, was officially mine, and my brothers were forced to accept the reality that their carefully laid plans had been completely and totally thwarted. But my mother's true legacy was not in the financial defeat she had inflicted on them, it was in the psychological and emotional reckoning that followed. For Mark and Thomas, losing the money was a significant blow, but losing their sense of superiority, their belief in their own invincibility, was far more devastating. 4 weeks after our confrontation, they refused to speak to me, communicating only through terse emails from their lawyers that reiterated their displeasure and their intention to explore all legal options. But as the reality of their situation set in, as they began to understand the full scope of their miscalculation, their anger slowly gave way to something else, something that looked like confusion, and then, perhaps, even a glimmer of introspection. The first crack in their unified front came from Mark. He called me 3 weeks after our confrontation, his voice devoid of its usual confident bluster. "I've been thinking about what Mom wrote in her letter," he said quietly. "About how our success had created a distance between us. I think she was right." He told me about the pressure he had felt his entire life to live up to our father's expectations, about how his relentless pursuit of success had become a kind of addiction, a way of validating his own self-worth. He admitted that he had neglected our mother during her illness, not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't know how to be present with her suffering, how to offer emotional support when all he knew how to offer was financial solutions. "I thought paying for the best doctors was the same as being a good son," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't realize that what she really wanted was my time, my attention, my presence. I didn't realize that until it was too late." Our conversation was difficult and painful, but it was also the first truly honest conversation I had had with my older brother in years. For the first time, he was not the successful real estate developer talking to his less successful younger sister, He was just a man grieving the loss of his mother and regretting the mistakes he had made. Thomas's transformation took longer. As a lawyer, his instinct was to view the situation as a legal problem to be solved rather than an emotional one to be understood. He spent weeks consulting with other estate lawyers, trying to find a loophole in my mother's documents, a weakness in her legal strategy. But when every lawyer he consulted told him the same thing, that the case was unwinnable, that my mother's intentions were clear and legally protected, he was finally forced to confront the reality of his defeat. His phone call came a month after Mark's, and his apology was as precise and formal as a legal brief. "Clara," he began, "I have reviewed the relevant documents and consulted with legal counsel, and I have come to the conclusion that our initial interpretation of the estate's distribution was incorrect. I apologize for any distress our actions may have caused you." It was not the heartfelt apology I might have hoped for, but for Thomas, it was a profound admission of error. He had been outmaneuvered, not just legally but morally, and his lawyer's mind could not help but respect the strategic brilliance of our mother's final plan. "I underestimated you, Clara," he admitted, his voice carrying a note of grudging admiration. "And I underestimated Mom. I thought I understood the law, but I didn't understand the power of a mother's love to protect her children." The healing process for our family was long and difficult. The trust that had been broken could not be repaired overnight, and the resentments that had been building for years did not simply disappear. But for the first time in our adult lives, we began to have real conversations, to talk about our feelings rather than just our accomplishments, to see each other as siblings rather than as competitors. Chapter 7: A New Family. The house that had been the source of our conflict now became the center of our reconciliation. I did not sell it, as my brothers had intended, but instead turned it into the family home that our mother had always wanted it to be. I invited Mark and Thomas for dinner the following Sunday, not to gloat over my victory, but to begin the difficult work of rebuilding what had been broken. The first dinner was awkward and stilted, filled with long silences and polite but meaningless conversation. But we continued to meet every Sunday, and gradually, the walls between us began to come down. We talked about our childhood, about our memories of our mother, about the different ways we had experienced her love and her expectations. We talked about our father, whose relentless focus on success had shaped all three of us in ways we were only now beginning to understand. We talked about the choices we had made, the paths we had taken, and the people we had become. Mark began to spend less time at the office and more time with his own family, rediscovering a connection with his wife and children that he had neglected in his pursuit of professional success. He started volunteering at a local community center, using his real estate expertise to help low-income families find affordable housing. Thomas, inspired by my mother's legal foresight, began to shift his legal practice away from corporate mergers and toward estate planning for ordinary families. He started offering pro bono services to clients who couldn't afford expensive legal advice, using his skills to protect people from the kind of exploitation he had once been willing to perpetrate. And I, for the first time in my life, felt like an equal in my own family. My brothers no longer saw me as the sensitive one, or the less successful one. They saw me as the sister who had been strong enough to care for our mother, wise enough to understand her final wishes, and generous enough to offer them a path back to the family they had almost destroyed. The inheritance I had received from my mother provided me with a level of financial security I had never known, but I did not stop teaching. Instead, I used my newfound resources to create a scholarship fund at my high school, providing financial assistance to students who wanted to pursue careers in the arts and humanities, the so-called impractical professions that my mother had always valued. But the most significant change was in how we, as a family, chose to honor our mother's memory. Instead of selling her house and dividing the profits, we decided to keep it as a central gathering place for our entire family. We hosted holidays there, celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, and created new memories that honored the spirit of the woman who had brought us all together. One afternoon, about a year after our confrontation, my brothers and I were in the attic, sorting through old boxes of my mother's belongings. We found old photo albums, forgotten home movies, and a box of letters that she had saved from our childhood. In one of those letters, written by me when I was 10 years old, I had asked my mother what she wanted most in the world. Her reply, written in the margins of my childish scrawl, was simple and profound. What I want most, she had written, is for my 3 children to love each other, to support each other, and to always remember that family is the most valuable thing we will ever have. As we read those words together, all 3 of us began to cry. Not with the raw grief of loss, but with the quiet gratitude of understanding. Our mother had not just left us a house and an inheritance, she had left us a final, powerful lesson about the true meaning of wealth. Her second will had not been an act of punishment, it had been an act of love, a desperate attempt to guide her children back to each other, to remind them of the values she had tried to instill in them her entire life. She had known that the only way to get my brother's attention was to speak to them in the language they understood best, the language of money and legal contracts. But her goal had not been to disinherit them financially, it had been to re-inherit them emotionally, to bring them back into the fold of a family they had almost abandoned. If you've ever felt underestimated by your family, if you've ever had to fight for what you believe is right, I want you to share this story. Not as a tale of revenge, but as a testament to the fact that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the quietest voices have the most important things to say. The house still stands, a monument not to my victory over my brothers, but to our mother's victory over the forces that had threatened to tear us apart. It is a house filled with laughter again, with the sounds of a family that has been broken and then rebuilt, stronger and more honest than it ever was before. And every Sunday, when we gather for dinner in the dining room where my brothers once delivered their ultimatum, we raise a glass to the woman who taught us all a final, powerful lesson, that the greatest inheritance is not the money we leave behind, but the love we create in the hearts of those we leave behind. That is a lesson worth more than any house, any will, any amount of money in the world.